All right, guys, we're going to do 17.5, talk about Woodrow Wilson's administration domestically. We're going to talk a lot more about him when we do World War I, but he kind of comes into a different kind of progressivism, and we're going to discuss how that had political, economic, and social change in the United States.
And we're also going to talk about, what impact did these make and what long-term and short-term impacts will they have. So, Woodrow Wilson's background. Woodrow Wilson was a Southerner at heart, and we see this play out in his presidency because he really fails to live up to expectations when it comes to African-American relations and support for civil rights. He attends college in the North, becomes president of Princeton, and is known as a social reformer, progressive reformer in New England. And so when Teddy Roosevelt and Taft run, obviously both as progressives within the Republican and Progressive Party, the Democrats nominate Woodrow Wilson, a progressive Democrat, for their ticket, recognizing that the political tide is shifting in that direction. And it ends up working out for them. We talked about in 1704 how Taft and Roosevelt split up that vote and allowed Wilson to win with only 42% of the popular vote. So he really has a lot of people to convince during his presidency why they should go along with his ideas.
And economically, we talked about this in the previous section, that Wilson hated big business. He thought all big businesses were bad. While Roosevelt and Taft could kind of deal with some trusts and some monopolies, Wilson thought all of them were wrong, right? And he gets the Clayton Antitrust Act passed, which actually makes having a monopoly illegal, and it also makes the shareholders and members of these companies that are deemed to be monopolies legally responsible for things. So they can actually charge these people with crimes if they violated them, right? So there's a lot more teeth to Wilson's economic reform and breaking up these trusts and breaking up these monopolies, because he believed that big businesses like this really hurt the American consumer.
And one of the important things to keep in mind is there have been anti-monopoly laws, antitrust laws in the past, but they just really weren't effective. Oftentimes the businesses could just sue and tie it up in court for years, sometimes over a decade, to prevent actually having to do anything. So Wilson wanted to make sure he got a law passed that was going to allow them to actually enforce the laws on the books. He also created a new tax system. He lowered the tariffs, which would create more competition from Europe, which will force American businesses to create a better product, lower their prices, treat their workers better, and just become overall better businesses. And then he passed a federal income tax to raise money for the government. Now, if you remember, the federal income tax was actually first passed by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War to help fund the war, but was later deemed unconstitutional. So they had to pass an amendment, the 16th Amendment, to the Constitution to allow Congress to pass a federal income tax, determine how much it would be.
And this is a big shift in how the government funds itself, right? Tariffs had been the way the government paid for everything back then, and then as we lower the tariffs and raise the income tax rate, we're going to see a lot more different, and the government's going to make a lot more money taxing incomes. Mm-hmm. Right? He also institutes the Federal Reserve System, which basically is a central bank. There's 12 districts, and these are basically banks for banks. They can lend money to banks. They can create more money and put it in the supply, right? Because before the Federal Reserve System, the growth in the economy that was happening, the currency and the money supply couldn't keep up with the growth, and it kind of constrained the credit markets and the way allowing businesses and people to borrow money.
And what this will do is this gives government, as you notice, there's sort of a theme here, more government interference, more government involvement. This gives the government the opportunity to control the distribution of money, which allows them to control the inflation or deflation rate of the American dollar, which will hopefully create, in theory, a much more stable financial system. But if you know your American history, you know that in about 15 years, it's going to be the worst economic collapse in world history. So although it was a good idea, it was not implemented effectively and really needed a lot of work.
You need credit to grow the economy, but too much credit can destroy the economy, exactly. Right? And it's finding that balance.
Yep. Yeah. Very good.
The women's rights movement really kind of it paused during Teddy Roosevelt's administration. There hadn't been a lot of success. It lost their lawsuits. The amendment wasn't being brought up in the Senate. The states weren't allowing women the right to vote, but it kind of, towards Wilson's administration, you have a much more energetic women's rights movement. They start winning a few more western states, like Arizona, New Mexico, California, Wyoming, right? Some of these states out west, on top of the original states, allow women to vote. And you have the success of the British suffragette movement, women's rights movement, the women's voting movement, that kind of leads to this new enthusiasm and new tactics and new energy in the American women's rights movement.
Carrie Chapman Catt becomes the national leader for what will become the National Association, or National American Women's Suffrage Association. She was the leader of the suffragette movement in New York, and she was elected leader of this national movement. And they wanted to focus on a few major goals. First off, you have to be highly organized. In order for anything to be politically effective, it has to be very highly and meticulously organized. And you can ask anyone who's run for a major office that has to be the case. Everything that goes on behind the scenes is more important oftentimes than what you see. There have to be close ties between local, state, and national associations. Remember, all politics is local. So if you want to make change on a big level, you have to start making change on the local and state level first. And 3 and 4 are very interesting, right? Catt believed there had to be cautious lobbying and there had to be ladylike behavior. Keep in mind, women are fighting, I wouldn't say against, but in a way they are, this idea that ladies act a certain way. Women, especially in public, act a certain way. The women in the suffragette movement had to make sure they didn't turn public opinion against them. So they had to act ladylike. They had to act the way that men would expect them to act. Because remember, all of the people who are going to be voting on the 19th Amendment are men. They have to get a huge supermajority of men to agree to give them the right to vote. And this is actually very interesting, and it's a very prudent strategy, because in the 1970s, women will fight for the ERA, or the Equal Rights Amendment, which basically provides them with civil rights that they thought they were being kept from. And one of the reasons why people were against the ERA movement is because the women were very aggressive and very outspoken and didn't act ladylike and turned a lot of people off, women and men, off from their movement. So this was actually a very wise strategy, and it eventually worked with the passage of the 19th Amendment.
Okay, you can see from this political cartoon that not everyone was totally on board with this, right? You can see the man is sitting at home wearing an apron, carrying the babies, right? This cartoon saying that that is the women's proper place, that she should be home in the kitchen taking care of the children, right? Not going out and voting and carrying out public life, right? But a lot of progressives actually supported this because women tend to be more progressive, right? So the progressives saw allowing women to vote as a way to get more progressive reforms through, because women would vote for these progressive politicians.
And not only that, but you see that, the teacups are flipped over, the plates are a mess, the cat's freaking out that the woman's leaving, not just the babies. But what you want to see here is this propagandizing of women's votes, right? So the critics of women's votes, women's voters are arguing that this more ambitious woman, this more socially progressive woman, more involved woman, is a selfish woman. She's giving up her duties at home, right? The natural duties of a woman, to take care of the home and take care of the children. She is just throwing that aside for her own ambitions. And oftentimes that was twisted in a very unfair way towards women, basically treating them as so much more selfish than the men.
You can see that's why that cat is reacting that way.
Yeah,
I'm totally shocked by the gender norms being switched.
It recognizes it. But then you have the limits of progressivism. So we've talked about progressivism for a while now, and following this unit, we're going to be moving on to other things. So we need to wrap up the limits of progressivism. Progressivism, there's a huge amount of change during the progressive era. Obviously, many things were changed in business, in society, and in politics. But this huge movement towards progressive change really comes to an abrupt halt towards the end of the 19-teens because of the outbreak of war in Europe. Americans socially, politically, economically need to shift their focus to providing for the Allies and giving them weapons, providing for our soldiers, and committing ourselves to a successful war in what at the time, World War I, is going to be viewed as the greatest war in world history.
And people are just kind of tired of all the change. They
Yeah.
just wanted it to be the way it was.
Yeah.
Just to stay kind of still, right? And you see that in civil rights, the progressive movement, which you would think has lots of opportunity for civil rights, really fails spectacularly in this field. Like we talked about Teddy Roosevelt, where it was kind of a lukewarm embrace, right? Wilson is actually endorsed by the NAACP. All kinds of African Americans voted for him, especially in the North, right? He was talking about equality. They're talking about a federal anti-lynching law. And all that stuff that he kind of promised in the campaign trail never comes through.
Yeah. And you have to remember, from his perspective, Wilson is a Southerner. He has his roots in the South. He's a Democrat. That's his political base. He needs those people to come out and vote for him. And there are hundreds of millions of African Americans in the South who voted for Woodrow Wilson, but really he never followed through with his promises. He even resegregated the military. So it was pretty disappointing for many African Americans and white Americans.
He definitely made it worse. I mean, he appointed segregationists to head federal agencies that were desegregated and then segregated them. So it was actually a huge step backwards on civil rights.
And this is something we'll talk more about in class, and we'll get into more detail. Anything else?
I'm good, Coach. If you
All right.
have any other questions, make sure to ask your history teacher.